Yeah, I'm going to move straight into the second half of the second chapter in Tom Chatham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and the Angel Out Ahead. The context for this is found in the first 5 minutes of the first video in the series. And also this is in the context of the other, four episodes, which aren't all strictly necessary, but this is going to be, we're talking about the history of Persian religion and cosmology in pre-Islamic Iran. And we're now moving into the second age of Persia, which is after the invasion. And so I'm going to more or less move straight in. It's from page 61 in chapter 2, An Oriental Theosophy by Tom Chatham. So the age of Islam. A brief sketch of the religion of Islam is bound to be unbalanced and runs the risk of being misleading, but may nonetheless be useful for those who have little or no prior knowledge. Any serious student of Corbin will need to have some familiarity with this rich and complex tradition. At the same time, it must be clearly kept in mind that Corbin does not represent Islam, and his attitude and approach to things Islamic is colored by his affinity for Shi'ism and by his personal philosophical project. With these caveats in mind, we turn to an outline of those aspects of Islamic religion and history that are perhaps most essential for an initial approach to Corbin's work. Arabia in the 7th century was a cultural backwater that had remained isolated throughout the history of the Fertile Crescent civilizations because of its remoteness and harsh climate. Many of the Semitic Arabs lived a largely nomadic existence, but trade routes from Yemen to the Mediterranean and Persia had allowed the establishment of a handful of small cities and the development of a prosperous merchant class. The influence of Judeo-Christian beliefs on the prevailing religion seems to have been minimal. The religious center was Mecca, where the temple of the Kaaba, literally the cube, was located. The ritual circumambulation of the Kaaba and the black stone of celestial origin that it contains was a part of the annual pilgrimage to Arafat. The Lord of the Kaaba was Allah, which means simply God. But this figure had been eclipsed in importance by the three feminine deities who were his daughters. The Prophet Muhammad was born to a family of merchants in Mecca in around 570 CE. At the age of 40, after a series of ecstatic experiences during spiritual retreats into the hills and caves surrounding the city, he received in his sleep the first of the often overpowering revelations that were to come to him periodically until the end of his life. The angel Gabriel appeared to him and commanded him 4 times to, quote, read or recite. Recovering from his shock, Muhammad finally asked, "What shall I read?" Gabriel said, "Read in the name of your Lord who created man from an embryo. Read, for your Lord is most beneficent, who taught by the pen, taught man what he did not know." Thus began the revelation of one of the most influential sacred books in history. It was produced by or through a single man in the course of one lifetime. Muhammad was illiterate, as were most of his countrymen, and the individual revelations that make up the Quran were not gathered into a canonical form until after his death. It was memorized by the faithful in its entirety, as it is still by many today, as is not at all unusual in an oral culture. Muhammad was at first both frightened by the intensity of the experience and doubtful of its validity. He confided in his wife, Khadijah, who supported him during the crisis brought on by these powerful experiences. The continued eruption of the revelations in the end convinced him of their truth. And in 612, he began his public prophetic mission. According to tradition, in the year 617 or 619, partly in answer to the doubts of unbelievers, the prophet was taken up into heaven in a celestial ascent called the Mirage. And again, sorry if I mispronounce anything. Hope I can be forgiven for that. This event, mentioned briefly and elusively in the Quran, was to become the archetypal mystical experience in Islam. The Prophet's life from then on was one of political, spiritual, and social action of a high order. Unlike the figure of Christ, Muhammad was immersed in the life of the world. He is regarded by Muslims, those who have submitted to God's will, as the exemplary human. Supreme mystic, loving father and husband, fierce warrior, just statesman, revered teacher. But he was human. He was the messenger, not the message. The message, the revelation, the divine word, is the book. The status accorded to Muhammad as the most holy man has puzzled Christians who are accustomed to the quiet otherworldliness of most traditional accounts of Christ. But from the beginning, Islam has been a religion rooted in this world. For Islam, everything belongs to Allah. There can be no giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. There is a very real sense in which Islam is a most ecumenical religion and has from the beginning contained within its teachings a broad-minded attitude to religious diversity, though of course in practice this is often conflicted with reality. Islam sees itself as the culminating revelation and Muhammad as the seal of the prophets. There will be no others. This prophet is the last in a long series of God's messengers, beginning with Adam. Traditional sources suggest that the total number is 124,000, which makes for considerable diversity. The prophets most often mentioned in the Quran are Adam, Noah, David, Moses, and Jesus. All are worthy of the utmost respect. All were sent by God with a message particular to the people to whom it was directed. Quote, "For every people there is an apostle." Islam is the final, perfected, and inclusive, but not the exclusive, truth. From the beginning, the Prophet began to attract followers. They were convinced by the sudden transformation of an otherwise unremarkable, though honest and good man. Quote, "By the incredible eloquence of his language, in a culture where the importance of the mastery of language cannot be overestimated, and, quote, by the recognition that his message was something they had always known, but somehow stopped taking seriously." That message, although subject to 1,400 years of interpretations, is in essence simple and direct enough to be grasped by the simplest tribesman. There is one God, Allah, who must be obeyed. The reward for obedience is bliss in heaven. The punishment for disobedience is damnation in hell. And you cannot escape judgment. There will come the day of judgment at the end of time when justice will be done. But what is it that God demands? At the heart of the Islamic vision is the idea of wholeness, or the unity and oneness of God, Tawhid. This is no abstract monism. Oneness for humans, the perfection of the soul that is the goal of religious life, demands harmony, balance, and equilibrium. These are the primary characteristics of a life lived in accordance with the will of Allah. The three guiding concepts of the religion are Islam, Imam, and Ihsan. Islam is submission to God's will. This is the realm of action. Iman is faith in God, His angels, His books, His prophets, and the last day. This is the realm of understanding. Ihsan is doing what is beautiful. This is the realm of intention, of bringing the soul into harmony with action and understanding. To begin with, then, one must act in accordance with the rules articulated in the Quran. Muslims are united in adhering to the required practices of the 5 pillars. These are the minimal requirements for complete acceptance of the religion. The first is the recitation of the Shahada, which in its simplest form states only that, quote, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. The second is the Salat, the ritual prayer towards Mecca, performed 5 times a day. The third is the Zakat, the donation of a portion of one's wealth to the needy. This is only required of those who can afford it. The fourth pillar is fasting, that is, refraining from food, drink, smoking, and all sexual activity between dawn and dusk during the month of Ramadan. The fifth is the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca at least once in a lifetime for those who have the means to do so. Some Muslims add a 6th pillar, the jihad, or holy war. Quote, this is a poor translation of a practice that has been co-opted by extremists of all sorts. In essence, it refers to the necessity of the struggle for freedom and justice in an unjust world. But beyond these pillars of the faith, Islam has been characterized from the beginning by rules for right conduct that extend into every sphere of human activity. There is no aspect of life that is not included under God's purview. The compilation of laws is the Sharia. An important branch of Islamic learning involves jurisprudence, the study of the required, recommended, indifferent, discouraged, and forbidden practices, as laid out in the Quran, and the records of the actions and sayings of the Prophet, the Hadith. The masters of jurisprudence are those to whom Corbin refers with unmistakable disdain as the doctors of the law. And yet he recognizes, in accordance with the foundational theology of Islam, that without an outer form, there can be no inner meaning. But in all matters of the law, in all matters of life, it is always the book that is central to the faithful. As Christ is to Christianity, so the Quran is to Islam. The word itself is usually taken to mean to recite or to gather together. The book is the direct, unmediated word of God, and it is for any Western reader an unusual book indeed. It is made up of 114 chapters or surahs, which are arranged neither thematically nor chronologically in the order of their revelation, but by length. It is, in this at least, says Brown. Sorry. It is, in this at least, says Brown, more avant-garde than Finnegan's Wake. Quite. Nasser, who's an author, let me see if I can find his full name, S.H. Nasser. He wrote a book called Knowledge and the Sacred. writes, quote, many people, especially non-Muslims who read the Quran for the first time, are struck by what appears as a kind of incoherence from the human point of view. It is neither like a highly mystical text nor a manual of Aristotelian logic, though it contains both mysticism and logic. It is not just poetry, although it contains the most powerful poetry. The text of the Quran reveals human language crushed by the power of the divine word. It is as if human language was scattered into 1,000 fragments, like a wave scattered into drops against the rocks at sea. One feels, through the shattering effect left upon the language of the Quran, the power of the divine whence it originated. The Quran displays human language with all the weakness inherent in it, becoming suddenly the recipient of the divine word and displaying its frailty before a power which is infinitely greater than man can imagine. To non-Muslims, it is a difficult text to read. This is Cheetham. It seems elusive, disjointed, confusing, and illogical, with little or no narrative continuity. Early Western scholars dismissed it as unworthy of serious study. As Corbin comments, quote, it is commonly said in the West that the Quran contains nothing mystical or philosophical in it, in nature. Our concern here is to know what it is the Muslims themselves have actually discovered in it. And as attested by centuries of commentary and by all of Islamic civilization itself, there is a great deal in it indeed. The Prophet said that the Quran has 7 levels of meaning, and the last and highest is known only to God. Much of its essential character lies in its language. The Quran is written in Arabic. That is the language in which God revealed it to Muhammad, and unlike the Bible, it is not the Quran when it is translated. The language is essential to its essence. Arabic, like Hebrew and Aramaic, is a Semitic language. These are consonantal languages. That is, in the early written form, vowels did not appear. In the later development of the scripts, they may be indicated by diacritical marks. Each word is based upon a 3-letter root, which gives rise to a whole family of associated words, which are completely invisible in translation. It is an elusive language. It is an elusive language that loses a great deal in translation, and the aura of associations around each word makes it subject to a variety of interpretations. Arabic is unlike English in another crucial respect. English is full of abstractions, and good philosophical prose is expected to be abstract, general, universal, and timeless. The language of the Quran and of Arabic in general is rooted in sensual particulars. This fundamental difference in outlook is of importance for understanding the meaning and the direction of Corbin's work. William Chittick writes in, quote, The Self-Disclosure of God, an old joke among Orientalists tells us that every Arabic word has 4 meanings. 4 meanings. It means what it means, then it means the opposite of what it means, and then it has something to do with sex, and finally it designates something to do with a camel. Part of the truth of the witticism is the way it indicates how Arabic is grounded in everyday human experience. The rational mind tends to push the meaning of a word away from experience to what it means. But the imaginal mind finds the self-disclosure of the real in the sex and the camel. It is in the world's concrete realities that God is found, not in its abstractions. It was the discovery and exploration of this imaginal mind and the cosmology that accompanies it that captivated Corbin. The roots of social, political, and theological diversification within Islam are traceable directly to bloody and turbulent events that unfolded after the death of the Prophet in 632. His son-in-law Ali and his daughter Fatima, along with a small group of their supporters, claimed that Muhammad had chosen Ali to be his successor. But the elders of the community appointed the Prophet's close friend, Abu Bakr, as the first Imam or leader. Ali acceded to this in this choice, but did not give up his claim. Ali's partisans, the Shia or partisans, were not satisfied until 656, which is 24 years later, when Ali won his place as fourth Imam after the Battle of the Camel, fought against forces supported by the Prophet's wife, Aisha. His reign as leader lasted only 5 years until he was murdered by a member of a rival group. There was still no agreement on how successors should be chosen. At length, his son, Hussein, grandson of the Prophet, led an insurrection against the reigning Umayyad leader. In 680, on the plains of Karbala, south of Baghdad, his small band of supporters was slaughtered by the Umayyad army. This defeat marks the break between the Sunnis, followers of traditional practice, and the minority Shiites, partisans of the House of Ali. In the 8th century, the Shiites themselves split, again over the question of rightful succession to the Imam. Jafar al-Sadiq was the 6th Shiite Imam and the great-great-great-grandson of the Prophet. He had named his son Ismail, or it might be Ishmael, but Ismail to be his successor. But Ismail died before Jafar himself died in 765. His second son, Abdallah, died soon after without leaving an heir. Most Shiites accepted another of Jafar's sons as Imam, but a minority believed that Ismail was the only true heir, whether on earth or in heaven. They became the Ismailians, or Sevener Shiites. But a crisis arose for the majority again in 873, when the Imam Hassan died without leaving a successor. Stories sprang up to explain the lack of an apparent heir. It became accepted that Hassan must have had a son, but that he had disappeared or been hidden to escape persecution. He would have been the 12th Imam, and his followers became the Ithna Asharis, the Twelver Shiites. For the Ismailis, it is the 7th. For the Ithna Asharis, it is the 12th Imam, who is the eternal hidden Imam, who will reappear in the final days to bring victory to the faithful. Hodgson writes in a book called The Venture of Islam, quote, "The Imams, then, came to be invested with cosmic worth, and their lives reflected the sad vicissitudes of the divine cause among ungrateful mankind." Okay. The political fortunes of the Shiites rose and fell over the centuries, but with Islam as a whole, they were to remain a minority. The Ismailis were to establish the Fatimid dynasty from 909 to 1171 in North Africa, whose capital at Cairo rivaled Baghdad as a center of commerce, art, and science in the 11th century. Twelver Shi'ism became the official religion of Persia in the 16th century. It is in Twelver, and especially in Ismaili Shi'ism, that Islamic esotericism developed to an extraordinary degree. It is this aspect of Islam that drew Henry Corbin most strongly. Again, just to clarify, the Ismaili Shiism is the Sevener branch, which appears to be the where, quote, Islamic esotericism developed to an extraordinary degree, and less so, but still so in Twelver Shiism. Okay. And those were both splits within Shiism, which is again a minority opposed to Sunni Islam. The Sunni Shiite schism raises a complex question concerning the relationship between Shiism and Sufism, usually regarded as the mystical branch of Sunni Islam or of Islam as a whole. Of the spirituals, meaning spiritual people, I guess, to whom Corbin refers, most, with the notable exception of Ibn Arabi, are Shiites. Both Sufism and Shiism express the esoteric side, or for Corbin and the esotericists, the inner core of Islam. So most of them are Shiites rather than. So again, Sufism is regarded as the mystical branch of Sunni Islam or of Islam as a whole. And most of the people that Corbin's referring to are Shiites. Although both Sufism and Shiism express the esoteric side. And the notable exception is Ibn Arabi, who's not a Shiite. Okay. Nasser, who's again the author that we were talking about a little, who is also a Shiite, summarizes the relation succinctly. Quote, one can say that Islamic esotericism or gnosis crystallized into the form of Sufism in the Sunni world, while it poured into the whole structure of Shiism, especially during its early period. From the Sunni point of view, Sufism presents similarities to Shiism and has even assimilated aspects thereof. From the Shiite point of view, Shiism is the origin of what later became known as Sufism. But here, by Shiism, is meant the esoteric instructions of the Prophet. Shiism and Sunnism have their roots in the very origin of the Islamic revelation, placed there providentially to accommodate different psychological and ethnic types. Broadly speaking, Sufism is often the term used to refer to the esoteric approach to Islam as a whole, but one must be careful to notice what the context is and how a given author uses these terms. It should perhaps be pointed out that Sufism, in this wider sense, has in common with Christian monasticism a focus on the spiritual life. But it is really a very different phenomenon. Nasser writes, since it is based upon the social and judicial teachings of Islam, Sufism is meant to be practiced within society and not in a monastic environment outside the social order. But the attitudes of monastic life are integrated with the daily life lived within the human community. Sufism is the way of integration of the active and contemplative lives, so that man is able to remain receptive inwardly to the influences of heaven and lead an intense inner contemplative life, while outwardly remaining most active in a world which he molds according to his inner spiritual nature, instead of becoming its prisoner, as happens to the profane man. The long history of disputes over rightful leadership of the Society of the Faithful points to a fact that is for Corbin one of the chief differences between the history of Christianity before the Reformation and the course of Islamic history. In Islam, there has never been a church or a phenomenon akin to the councils that established the dogmatic form of Christian doctrine. In Corbin's eyes, this absence of an official public and political hierarchy is in part responsible for the maintenance in Islam of an esoteric tradition that was quickly eclipsed by the official forms of Christian doctrine, since it threatened the power and authority of the clergy and the church. In Islam, there are no priests. Each Muslim stands alone before God. Corbin writes, what the Gnostics in Islam acknowledge is fidelity to the men of God, to the imams, the guides. Access to the heart of the religion requires a guide, but such guides are not, for Corbin, primarily purveyors or protectors of public dogma. They are rather the guardians of the secrets of the most personal initiation into the secret core of revelation. Now there's a 2-page section to finish the chapter, which is called Philosophy and Theology. And it goes, amid the tremendous political and social change that accompanied the spread of Islam, the continuity of the scholarly tradition can easily be overlooked. The work of translation undertaken by Islamic scholars of Greek texts, or much more frequently from Syriac translations of these texts into Arabic, should be understood as a continuation of the work begun during the Sasanian period, which was the fourth of 4 periods in pre-Islamic Persia. Baghdad, for instance, was to become a major intellectual focus beginning in 832, with the founding of a school there. Corbin comments, quote, all the technical vocabulary of philosophy and theology in the Arabic language was fashioned in this way during the course of the 9th century. But we must recall that we are embarked now on the study of that, quote, other history of being, which is written, thought, and lived in Persian and Arabic. Corbin cautions us to remember that from this point onwards, words and concepts possess a life of their own in Arabic. To resort to the Greek dictionary in order to translate the vocabulary used by later thinkers, who were themselves ignorant of Greek, can give rise to misunderstandings. In the 10th century, near Edessa, site of the original school of the Persians, the Sabians of Haran established another school. The syncretism of these thinkers is instructive. Quote from Corbin, they traced their spiritual line of descent back to Hermes and to Agathodaimon, the tutelary angel of Hermeticism, as al-Surawadi did later. Their doctrines bring together the ancient astral religion of the Chaldeans, studies in mathematics and astronomy, and Neo-Pythagorean and Neoplatonic spirituality. But as Corbin reminds us, syncretism is not a sin, and it may not result from an incoherent amalgamation of ideas, but rather spring from the perception of pre-established harmonies among various systems. The Sabaeans, through their ability to perceive these harmonies, serve as an important link in the history of esotericism in the West, as well as in Islamic culture. Among the many translations done in the early years of the Islamic period, there are several of surpassing importance that are pseudographia, works misattributed to one author or another. Of prime importance among these is the so-called Theology of Aristotle. This is in fact a paraphrase of the last 3 books of Plotinus' Enneads, that astonishing mystical work of the great Neoplatonist. In a famous passage in this Theology of Aristotle, in truth an account of the ecstatic experiences of Plotinus, from the 4th Ennead, mystical philosophers in Islam saw a connection between Greek philosophy and the celestial ascent of the Prophet. Among the other works attributed to Aristotle is the Book on the Pure Good, which is in fact an extract from the work of Proclus, the 5th century Byzantine Neoplatonist. There was also a vast body of works attributed to Plato, Pythagoras, and many others in circulation that also served to confuse the Islamic view of Greek thought. Add to this the pre-existing conflation of the Greek sages with Christian monks and ascetics due to the Syriac translators of the Sasanian dynasty, and the fusion of Abrahamic religion with Greek philosophy in its Platonic and Neoplatonic formulations begins to seem natural, if not inevitable. In the eastern part of Islamic Persia, the Greco-Oriental influences remained. Many scholars originated in Central Asia, Khiva, Merv, Balkh, and Bactria. We have already noted the heterogeneous nature of these cultures represented in these areas. The work of these scholars is the origin of many technical Persian terms in astronomy, astrology, and alchemy. This is evidence that the continuity between Greek alchemy and the later Islamic alchemical tradition was provided by the cultural centers of northern and eastern Persia and Central Asia. This, then, is a rough outline of the complex matrix of influences that guided the subsequent development of theosophical speculation and religious experience in the Islamic tradition, especially in Persia, that median and mediating world in which Henry Corbin found a spiritual home very different from that provided by Christianity and the traditions of the church. I think that more or less speaks for itself, so I will leave it at that. I will maybe simply offer that, as we saw, um, Corbin as a, very sort of open-minded, esoteric type, is obviously, yeah, he was disdainful of the, um, I forget what he described them as. I'll try and find it, but it's the, just finding that. Yeah, he's critical of these sort of masters of jurisprudence, the doctors of the law. And so the whole point would be like he does acknowledge that you need a sort of an outer form, an exoteric side, a dogma or a law. And the question would be, well, it's all very well for us to learn of Corbyn's perspective, but we that doesn't alleviate the necessity for some kind of structure or ordering principles to guide our engagement in the imaginal world, the archetypal world. And we need a version of dogma, of culture that is accessible to us, which seems acceptable to us, which we can believe in and rationally agree to. And so that's going to be the sticking point. Can we learn something from the esotericism, let's say? But is it possible, is it really possible for us to take those influences back into our own cultures and amid the psychosocial changes that are accompanying this time in history? And that's the challenge that remains before us, I think. I'm pointing out that the way is always a balance, a dialectic between tension between opposing forces. And to the degree that Corbyn is temperamentally biased toward one end, as many esoteric writers are, um, it may only work for an elite minority. It may not work as a new model for culture. And maybe it's unfair to ask for that from these sources. I guess I'm, again, in the context of the first video, bringing in that's what I feel is relevant. That's what I feel is important. And I don't know, I think it's kind of necessary to have a robust culture in place in order for esoteric release from that culture to be effective in some way. It's kind of like if we just aim to get out, to escape the matrix, then I think without having sort of a spiritual home to return to, then I think we get exposed to a lot of risks that can ultimately be very harmful. So the question is, again, if we're not going to the church anymore, what can replace that? and that remains to be seen.